Good morning and welcome to the Bulwark podcast. We are joined on this Wednesday, the day after the first hearing of the January 6th committee, by our colleague Bill Kristol. Bill, thanks for coming on the podcast. Appreciate it very much.
My pleasure as always, Charlie.
Okay, we need to warn the audience, not just simply about the explicit language, but we're going to be playing some sound bites from the last 24 hours, and we're not going to be editing them. We're not going to be bleeping them out, and some of them are going to be highly disturbing. So here's just the trigger warning that we're going to do it. In fact, we might as well just dive into, clear out the faint of heart right away at the top of the podcast so they don't spend 45 minutes and then realize, oh my goodness, this is terrible. I have to say that every once in a while you have these moments of clarity, and I think we had a lot of moments of clarity yesterday during that hearing. But one of the officers who testified and had, I think, some of the most dramatic testimony is Michael Fanone, who has told his story before. But did it very, very forcefully. And by the way, let's play the first Michael Fanone soundbite where I described it as close to an have you no shame moment as we are likely to get in Washington, D.C. these days. Of course, that's a reference to Joseph Welch and Joe McCarthy. But there was a moment when Michael Fanone called out members of Congress who have really turned their back on police officers like himself. Let's play that.
What makes the struggle harder and more painful is to know so many of my fellow citizens, including so many of the people I put my life at risk to defend, are downplaying or outright denying what happened. I feel like I went to hell and back to protect them and the people in this room. But too many are now telling me that hell doesn't exist or that hell actually wasn't that bad. The indifference shown to my colleagues is disgraceful. My law enforcement career prepared me to cope with some of the aspects of this experience. Being an officer, you know your life is at risk whenever you walk out the door, even if you don't expect otherwise law-abiding citizens to take up arms against you. But nothing, truly nothing, has prepared me to address those elected members of our government who continue to deny the events of that day, and in doing so, betray their oath of office.
This was a powerful moment, Bill Kristol. There were so many powerful moments. I admit I was surprised by how powerful, how riveting the testimony was, even though we've heard some of these stories before. It felt different yesterday, didn't it?
It did, and I had the same experience that I've been saying in a more kind of rarefied level, that in a certain way what happened between November 3rd and January 6th, the real attempts to subvert the election through the Justice Department, through the Defense Department, the calls to Georgia Secretary of State and pressuring the Michigan election officials and so forth, that was really fundamentally more serious than the insurrection itself on the 6th. That was terrible, of course, but it was, more symbolically terrible and terrible obviously for the officers. But I've got to say, I think I underestimate that. I think that's true at some level of kind of, political theory abstraction and in terms of what has to be fixed for the future in terms of election laws and so forth. But I also slightly underestimated just the drama of these Capitol Police doing their job and the degree to which it was a close run thing. It could have been a heck of a lot worse. Really huge. And this was in the U.S. Capitol. And I guess in that respect, when, you sometimes can overthink these things, and just the horror of the day, which I remember in real time, seeing it from here on television, just a few miles away from the Capitol, and thinking, my God, is this really happening in America? I think that was really brought home yesterday.
It really was. And one of the things that was also, I think, really underlined was how, much of the rights we back the Blue Lives Matter has really been a sham. I just think the reaction to Officer Fanone and Officer Dunn and Officer Gunnell, the mockery in conservative media was truly extraordinary. But just to give people a sense of the ugliness, and here's where I have the trigger warning about the language. This was played on CNN last night during Don Lemon's show. Michael Fanone came on and shared with listeners of CNN a voicemail call he received from somebody that I imagine thinks of themselves as a patriot, someone who loves America and supports law enforcement. But this is the raw, unedited voicemail message that was left for Officer Fanone last night.
People need to hear the kind of attacks that these officers are facing right now just for telling the truth about January 6th. Play it.
Yeah, this is from Michael Fanone, Metropolitan Police Officer. You're on trial right now, lying, and you want an Emmy, an Oscar? What are you trying to go for here? You're so full of shit, you little faggot fucker. You're a little pussy, man. I can slap you up the side of your head with a backhand and knock you out, you little faggot. You're a punk faggot. You're a lying fuck. How about all the scummy black fucking scum for 2 years, destroying our cities and burning them and stealing all that shit out of the stores and everything? How about that and assaulting cops and killing people? How about that, you fucker? That was shit on the goddamn Capitol. I wish they would have killed all you scumbags, because you people are scum. They stole the election from Trump, and you know that, you scumbag. And you fucking, too bad they didn't beat the shit out of you more. You're a piece of shit. You're a little fag, you fucking scumbag.
It was important for you. You did not want us to censor that. What do you say to that? What do you want people to know? And that idiot.
I remember like my first reaction immediately after listening to that phone call, which I actually received while I was testifying in the hearing today. This is what happens to people that tell the truth in Trump's America.
That simple.
That simple.
Well, it's also that ugly. Bill, Kristol, just give you a sense of the folks out there. And, I know that we're not supposed to use words like deplorable, but these are the deplorables out there. And I think that was one of the things that came through yesterday, was how ugly and hate-filled much of this attack was.
Yeah, and of course it's a massive country, and there can be one disturbed person, bigoted,
drunk,
repulsive person like that, somehow getting, I guess, Officer Fanone's cell phone number. That's a little worrisome. But again, I come back, you mentioned this in passing, to the, let's call them the conservative elites, or not really, the Trumpy rationalizers and defenders who have a presence on the media, on Fox News and obviously Newsmax, and have lots of followers on Facebook and Twitter. They're the in-between level that justifies this kind of thing and incites this kind of thing. You could, if they didn't exist, there'd be one of these characters somewhere and another one somewhere else, and some unpleasant things would happen, some ugly things would happen. But it wouldn't be this level of sustained vitriol, people being reinforced in their sense that they're entitled to behave like total, deplorable human beings. And the reason that people out there think they can do that is because they look up and they see people who are being featured guests on Fox News behaving like deplorable human beings.
Well, and also, we can't know for sure whether he had been watching television, but Laura Ingraham had actually devoted one of her segments to mocking the officers and saying that they were, vying for some sort of an Oscar or an acting award, and he seemed to be playing off all of that. So let's just talk about the political theater here. This was a very, very bad day, obviously, for the denialists and the Republicans who'd wanted to memory hole this. But also, I have to say that, there was all of this punditry out there about how, Nancy Pelosi had, broken norms and had undermined the credibility of the committee by rejecting some of the members of the Sedition Caucus that Kevin McCarthy wanted to put on. But I will tell you, what you saw yesterday was not a gift to Kevin McCarthy. The most dominant, the Republicans dominated the news cycle. You can disagree with me. Republicans dominated the news cycle yesterday, but unfortunately for Kevin McCarthy, they were Adam Kinzinger and Liz Cheney. And the split screen, I think, was absolutely awful for the McCarthy wing of the party. Here's Liz Cheney.
If those responsible are not held accountable, and if Congress does not act responsibly, this will remain a cancer on our constitutional republic, undermining the peaceful transfer of power at the heart of our democratic system. We will face the threat of more violence in the months to come, and another January 6th every 4 years.
So You and I have been watching Liz Cheney for some time, Bill, but I'm guessing that a lot of people were watching her and paying attention for the first time yesterday. And I just thought the contrast between her and Elise Stefanik and her and Kevin McCarthy could not have been more dramatic.
I totally agree. I mean, you were very strong right off the bat when Pelosi rejected two of the Republican nominees for the committee, and then McCarthy pulled the rest. You thought Pelosi had done the right thing. I kind of thought so, but I wasn't certain. I thought it could backfire a little or whatever. You thought you came out right away and said, good for her, and she's made a good decision here, and it's going to make the hearings more powerful, not less. And I think you were totally right, and Pelosi's totally vindicated in that decision. Cheney, was terrific, and Kinzinger was powerful too. And so the Cheney-Kinzinger wing of the Republican Party is much, much, much outnumbered right now. But certainly, I think if you were at all open to rethinking perhaps your previous allegiances or your previous accommodation or rationalization of the Trumpist wing, you saw stuff yesterday that might make you rethink. And, finally, I thought of you last night. Actually, was looking at some clips of the Capitol Police in the evening online. And, it's the Capitol Police. And I thought of one of our pet obsessions, Paul Ryan, who we've both known well, who's not exactly stepped up here in the last few years. He was Speaker of the House. He knows quite a lot about actually the Capitol Police and how that works. And, he must have dealt with those officers. I didn't know exactly who they were, but certainly dealt with these officers all the time, every day. He had his own protection and so forth from them, I believe. And Paul Ryan is the director of Fox Corporation. As you say, Laura Ingraham and Tucker Carlson and others on Fox have been trashing these Capitol Police who worked in the institution, protected the institution that Ryan had the highest position in, Speaker of the House, just 3 years ago. Maybe he could say something to the executives of Fox.
You would think so, or that he could have spoken out about this particular issue more forcefully than he has. So Liz Cheney obviously, was the ranking Republican member of this committee. And going back to this whole point about Nancy Pelosi, what Nancy Pelosi did was she vetoed the Republicans' attempt to turn this into a shit show. And the result was we got an actual substantive congressional hearing. Now, I'm sure that down at Mar-a-Lago, there was a lot of fuming. Nobody's defending me. Nobody's throwing crap at the witness, trying to discredit the witnesses. You have to, wait for OAN, Newsmax, and Fox News to do that. But that's what felt weird about yesterday. You're watching this and going, wow, this is Congress doing a real hearing, witnesses who are forceful and riveting and emotional and fact-based. And the performance, look, I mean, there's always an element of theater in politics. Let's not kid ourselves about that. But there was also real emotion that was surprising to me. And you got it from Adam Kinzinger. And again, Adam Kinzinger is not a household word outside of, circles like this podcast. But Adam Kinzinger, I think, also made a very, very powerful statement. And let's play a little bit of Adam Kinzinger from yesterday.
Mr. Chairman, and thank you to my colleagues on the committee. Thank you to our witnesses. I never expected today to be quite as emotional for me as it has been. I've talked to a number of you and gotten to know you. I think it's important to tell you right now, though, you guys may individually feel a little broken. You guys all talk about the effects you have to deal with, and you talk about the impact of that day. But you guys won. You guys held. Democracies are not defined by our bad days. We're defined by how we come back from bad days, how we take accountability for that. And for all the overheated rhetoric surrounding this committee, our mission is very simple. It's to find the truth, and it's to ensure accountability.
That was pretty strong. And I was listening to that thinking, so if you're Kevin McCarthy, all of your energy, all of your focus is exiling and excommunicating Liz Cheney and Adam Kinzinger. But this is who they are. These are the folks that this Republican Party wants to throw into outer darkness. And I wonder what people in the real world make of all of that? Because, especially for conservative Republicans who 5 minutes ago, everybody would have been exactly where Liz Cheney and Adam Kinzinger were, supporting and praising law enforcement, defending democracy, all of those things. And now they're the outliers. Bill. Yeah,
and I know Adam pretty well. I haven't talked to him recently, but, he served in the military, of course, a post 9/11 veteran. And I kind of think he's, especially with Officer Fanone, who had served, that he saw in this kind of these officers, still wounded psychologically as well as physically in some cases by what happened. He saw maybe sort of echoes of what he'd seen among some of the men and women he served with in Iraq, and I just think that maybe made it more emotional and more moving for him personally. It was almost like listening to people who'd been in combat talk about their experience and how searing it was.
Well, it was quite literally like that. Let me just play just a couple of more sound bites because you mentioned this. The sergeant, Aquilino Ganell, who actually had served in Iraq.
Ganell, right?
Yeah, yes. So, Sergeant, again, for the people out there who are saying this was a loving crowd, there were hugs and kisses, a normal tourist visit. My own Senator Ron Johnson, who said this was, a peaceful event. Again, how can you possibly sustain that after listening to what Sergeant Ganell said? Let's play that.
They tried to convert us. They tried to persuade us to let them in, yelling. And then once they saw that we were not doing that, then continued to even attack us even more. And it was nonstop. So my time compared to Iraq, totally different. This is our own citizens, people who we sworn an oath to protect, but yet they are attacking us with the same flag that they claim to represent.
And he basically goes on to say, nothing in my experience in the Army or as a law enforcement officer prepared me for what confronted us on January 6th. For the very first time, I was more afraid of working at the Capitol than in my entire Army deployment to Iraq. All right, so Bill, there was one other part of this that was just, really disturbing, and it's one of those that, one of those moments where you do wonder whether we do understand the depths of the hatred out there among the seditionists. This is Officer Dunn, who was. Who had been attacked last week by Tucker Carlson because I think they knew that he was going to say these things. But he's an African American officer, and he's describing the way the crowd treated him when he mentioned that he had voted for Joe Biden. So let's play this, and I guess this is in the context of are we still going to pretend that we don't have a problem with racism in this country? Let's play Officer Dunn.
I told him to just leave the Capitol, and in response they yelled, "No, man, this is our house. President Trump invited us here. We're here to stop the steal. Joe Biden is not the president. Nobody voted for Joe Biden. I'm a law enforcement officer, and I do my best to keep politics out of my job. But in this circumstance, I responded, well, I voted for Joe Biden. Does my vote not count? Am I nobody?" That prompted a torrent of racial epithets. One woman in a pink MAGA shirt yelled, "You hear that, guys? This nigger voted for Joe Biden." Then the crowd, perhaps around 20 people, joined in screaming, "Boo, fucking nigger." No one had ever called me a nigger while wearing the uniform of a Capitol Police officer.
All right, so Bill, I guess this is what do you say about that?
Yeah, no, it's kind of speechless, right? I mean,
well, especially with this revisionism that's taking place, where and led by Donald Trump, which is to retcon the whole thing that these were patriots. The polls showing that a large number of Republicans think that these people were trying to defend freedom. You have press conferences that are trying to turn many of the protesters into martyrs. This, I think, underlines the depths of the dishonesty here. So I guess the main question, Bill, is, does any of this actually make a difference? I mean, I'm really torn because we've lived through this so many times. We've seen the evidence laid out. We've had dramatic testimony, and nothing ever seems to matter. Is that the case here, though, as well?
I mean, I don't know. I share your sort of skepticism that something might matter, but I would say this is a point I think you've made, and Jonathan Last also made in a recent newsletter, which is, of course, most Trump supporters, Trump voters don't use the N-word, one presumes, and don't leave horrible voicemails, calling people faggots and so police officers. And, I mean, those epithets say a lot about the people using them, right? And their own crazy insecurities and craziness and prejudices. But again, most people aren't like that. Let's just stipulate that. Most of the Trump supporters, but do they repudiate them? This is the point the JVL made in the newsletter. This has been tolerated as a fringe of the conservative movement, and maybe more than a fringe, honestly. Fringe of the Republican Party, maybe more than a fringe. Not a lot of sense that you have to repudiate and discipline the party and the movement. You have to repudiate these kinds of people. You have to police the borders, prevent this from spilling over. And it's been tolerated. And of course, you have ex-president of the United States, fanning the flames. And so I have very little patience for all the sort of decent Trump supporters who are out there saying, well, I myself wouldn't have quite stormed the Capitol or beaten up a Capitol police officer. I don't really approve of leaving voicemails like that. Well, fine. Well, have you denounced it? If you're an elected official, if you're a mayor or a governor or a member of Congress, even if you're a citizen, have you told others in your circles that this is totally unacceptable and un-American? I mean, people need to step up here and manage, and deal with the people they've been tolerating, it seems to me.
Hey, let's take a quick break here. We'll be back with more from with Bill Kristol. And Bill, I want to talk to you about your latest "I am alarmed" tweets, because one of the things that we've learned is that when Bill Kristol tweets out that he is alarmed, attention must be paid, and I want to talk about that when we come back. Hey, Charlie Sykes here. Just a quick reminder, if you sign up for Bulwark Plus, you will have access to our morning newsletters, to JVL's Triad, as well as our whole suite of podcasts. This one will remain free, but if you want to listen to the Secret Podcast or participate in our live streams or others like the Next Level Podcast, please consider joining Bulwark Plus. We're back with more with Bill Kristol. Bill, I have to ask you about your tweet the other day that you were alarmed about the Biden administration's lack of more forceful action on the Delta variant and the coronavirus. And as I mentioned earlier, your previous series of "I am alarmed" tweets, if anything, may have understated the degree to which we all should have been alarmed. So give me your sense of where we're at and what you think, and what you think the Biden administration needs to do when it's confronted with this new challenge.
I mean, I think it may have turned out the Biden administration was a little more alarmed than they were letting on a couple of days ago when I wrote those tweets, because they, I guess, are getting ready to announce mandatory vaccination of the federal workforce. Stopping short still of the military, which I think is really ridiculous. In terms of where we are more broadly, I actually recommend, if I can promote my own conversations, these conversations with Bill Kristol, which we've discussed before. I recorded one with Ashish Shah, the Dean of Public Health at Brown, who's a very prominent public health expert and commentator on this, very sensible and balanced. Yesterday. It'll be out late today. So people listening to this podcast can then move on to listen to or watch the conversation with Ashish Shah. And he's pretty alarmed. I mean, this Delta, the combination of the Delta variant and 30% of adults unvaccinated is a dangerous combination, very dangerous for the unvaccinated and somewhat dangerous for those who are vaccinated, who, thank God, because of the vaccine, are probably not going to get terribly ill or die, but who have a greater chance of contracting the virus than one would have thought a month ago when it was pre-Delta variants, and then can transmit it further, keep it alive, make it harder to get the whole thing under control. So he's very strongly, and I would say in terms of policy, a little bit of masking wouldn't hurt, a little bit of distancing again, but the vaccine is by far the most effective, by the important thing. I mean, the decisive thing. I asked Ashish that, what's the one thing that would make a huge difference? What would make a huge difference is if 85 or 90% of adults were vaccinated, not 70%, because you have exponential growth. And so just getting that denominator, if that's the right way to think about it, to a lower number of those who can get infected much more easily since they're not vaccinated, and then spread it, will keep this surge more manageable, result in fewer deaths, and finally, and I think importantly, less disruption, because I am worried now that the whole social, educational, economic opening up that's been going pretty well until a couple of weeks ago and looked like in the fall would be back to something close to normal. It's going to be a bit delayed. It's going to be a bit less normal. There are going to be more conferences getting canceled. Let's hope the school year stuff goes well. That's very important for the country. It doesn't matter that much if some business, delays their reopening 3 weeks, presumably, but it matters to the people running the coffee shop in the ground floor of that office building. But you can live with that. It's the schools that I'm now worried about, because the kids, of course, aren't vaccinated. Ashish is pretty optimistic that the FDA could approve a vaccine for ages 5 through 12 by maybe October, and that would be great.
That seems important.
Yeah, very important. So anyway, the whole thing but Ashish agreed with me, and he's very measured in his way of discussing these things, but that there's a slight lack of urgency perhaps in the Biden administration, a little bit of wanting to defend what they've done. And the FDA has had this process in place for a long time about how you get from being emergency use to regular use. And it's like a little ridiculous at this point. I mean, could we just if that's an obstacle to getting 10% more people vaccinated, which would be a huge public health benefit for this country, change your FDA procedures. And so I think the Biden administration, as is often the case, I'd say with Biden, I've been struck by this, they kind of a little slow, a little late sometimes. They usually kind of pivot to more or less the sensible thing, but, maybe a week after they should have. But let's hope they're really pivoting now. And I think the military is very important. There's a quote I came across this morning. I tweeted it from someone in the military saying, if they really thought this was important, and that's someone who wasn't vaccinated, 30% of the military isn't vaccinated. And he says, if they really thought this was important, then make us do it. I mean, this is the military.
Right, I saw that.
Yeah. And I very much believe that to be the case. And I think the effect of the military, it's a lot of other people out there looking at it and saying, they control the military. The military is used to taking orders. They're used to getting vaccinated for a million shots for a million different things, And so if they're not making them get shots, maybe I'll just put it off more as well, because I'm a little uncertain. And my uncle says he's got some, ridiculous Newsmax stuff that shows that it's not going to work and so forth. So, or it's dangerous. So I think the utility I do think the military would be an important moment at which one could say, okay, look, we're not messing around here. Everyone's got to get vaccinated, and private sector organizations would find it easier to do it if the military were doing it, the federal government were doing it, city and state governments, businesses. I think you could get up to that higher number pretty fast if a lot of big organizations really start mandating that people be vaccinated, as they should.
So you are seeing a number of Republicans who are becoming a little more forceful in saying that people ought to take vaccines. Even Mitch McConnell is saying it. Roy Blunt in Missouri is actually having a press conference where he's reading articles about people who didn't get vaccinated and are dying. Since we've been beating up on Kevin McCarthy, he tweeted out this morning. Kevin McCarthy is really extraordinary. Actually, he tweeted it out last night. This is after the CDC changed its recommendations on wearing masks. Make no mistake, McCarthy tweeted, the threat of bringing masks back is not a decision based on science, but a decision conjured up by liberal government officials who want to continue to live in a perpetual pandemic state. I mean, if that came from Charlie Kirk, you'd go, Charlie Kirk's an idiot. But this is the minority leader in the House of Representatives, but focusing on masks as opposed to the vaccines. I don't know. I mean, there's this vast conspiracy that the liberal government just wants this pandemic to go on. Do they really believe that? I mean, does anyone? I suppose there are some people who believe it, but this is part of the demagoguery. You just assume that McCarthy understands that no one wants the pandemic to go on forever. Certainly not liberal government, right?
Right.
And yet he panders to that. And by pandering to that, he panders to the resistance for people to behave in a responsible way.
Totally. I mean, the masks are less important much less
Right.
important than the vaccine, and
Much less
unfortunately, less effective probably against the Delta variant. So again, but I just got an email from a very close friend this morning saying she was going to go to the grocery store. It just happened. We were texting, so she just mentioned she was going. Wasn't like the point of it, and she was going to wear a mask. But you know what? You don't know, and maybe it'll help a little bit on the margin. And again, we don't have a situation where Giant or Safeway can put out a sign saying every employee at this store is vaccinated. That would be, now if that were the case,
right,
you still don't know about all the fellow shoppers and so forth, but still that might change people's behavior. Anyway, the mask but it's harmless, right? I mean, why is Kevin McCarthy upset if people want to wear masks?
Because it's a symbol for him. Like I personally hate wearing the mask. Okay, this is not a political position. It's not something that affects my behavior, except I don't go certain places. But the alternative message would be, you hate wearing masks, then make sure your neighbor and your family members get vaccinated. Do the pivot. If you want to go maskless, then support efforts to vaccinate. If you want to be mad at somebody about having to wear a mask, don't be mad at the government. Be mad at the bozos who have been listening to Newsmax and or maybe Kevin McCarthy's Twitter feed and are not vaccinated. And I do think there's going to be real anger over the people who have refused to be vaccinated.
Yeah, and if Kevin McCarthy and Scalise and Stefanik, instead of standing up there and trashing the Capitol Police and their fellow Republicans, Liz Cheney and Adam Kinzinger, they could stand up there and say, we are the leaders of this big political party in the House. We're close to a majority. And we are urging every single person who voted for Republican and everyone else too, this last November, to get vaccinated. That would have a little impact. Maybe people, I'm not saying people see Kevin McCarthy and Elise Stefanik and go, oh my God, but it would move some people on the margin. They don't even think of doing it because they're so irresponsible. It's kind of infuriating, honestly, because we're going to pay a big price for this. People are really going to get sick and die because of the total irresponsibility of these people.
So let's talk about Simone Biles for a minute, because you had an interesting tweet about this. I find it amazing watching some of these conservative commentators. The Charlie Kirks of the world. I don't even know if I describe him as conservative, but there he is on video. Wearing a hat with an American flag, rooting against the American teams in the Olympics. He's got 2.5 million views on this one video in which he calls Simone Biles a selfish sociopath and a shame to the country. We are raising a generation of weak people like Simone Biles. And you tweeted out, even by Trumpist standards, Charlie Kirk is impressively repulsive.
I mean, I don't follow gymnastics much. I haven't followed the Olympics much. I didn't follow that gymnastics scandal too much. It was really horrifying to read about a little. You'd think maybe Charlie Kirk would have, so just from a human point of view, to sort of trash this fantastically impressive young woman because,
who could crush his head with her thighs.
Yeah.
She could crush his head like a melon. And here's a guy who like 5 minutes ago was like, selling, peddling pills because he couldn't move around. And he's mocking one of the greatest athletes of our time. I mean, like Simone Biles has anything to prove to
who's shown an unbelievable amount of dedication and, in a way, if you just, not to get too earnest, but if you're thinking about the next generation or two, you know what? I'd be thrilled if we have a lot of America full of Simone Biles and not of, rather than of Charlie Kirk. So they're about the same age. Which one has accomplished more, incidentally, in his or her life, So just but the lack of human sympathy is what's so striking there. And also, incidentally, this was, I think it's the case that she and certainly many of her colleagues, unfortunately, were molested by this horrible doctor, And how about a little bit of, if we're going to get critical of people, let's be critical of the authorities that allowed this to happen and covered it up and so forth. There's some genuine institutional problems in America, but being critical of this young woman is really astonishing. But again, Charlie Kirk, he's accomplished so much. He's been such a role model, really, and such an encouraging, sign of where young America is going. I hope all this hurts. Just the lack of human sympathy.
Yeah, it is. There's no empathy. And then also just regarding what was the Federalist, arguing something like, this is not about her. Her job is to go out there and win medals for the United States. Well, which treats her as purely, instrumental, right? I mean, it's just she's like a thing, that we use to, advance, as opposed to, no, this is a human being who has human issues and who has accomplished more in her life than you will ever do, and yet you sit on your fat ass and you judge her. It's and also, what is the conservative principle? What is the conservative issue? What is it about the right that feels the need to make this an issue? Decisions by athletes. You have people who are rooting against the women's soccer team. Where did we get on all this? I mean, I understand
it's really appalling at so many levels, the human level, the kind of intellectual level, if you want to put it this way, that these entitled jackasses are looking down at people who've achieved so much more than they have or will, frankly. But, not to get again too serious about it, but so people have read a lot about sports, obviously, over the years. Yeah. Michael Novak, the late Michael Novak, neoconservative writer and thinker, Catholic thinker, wrote a book called The Joy of Sports, which I remember enjoying 30 years ago or so. But I think one of the points that's often made about sports is about the Olympics, for example. It's great. You root for your team. You root for the Bucks. You root for the USA. And that's so there's a kind of communal solidarity or patriotism, even in the case of the Olympics. But you also recognize excellence. One of the great things about sports is that it has both, right? It's not recognizing excellence by itself without regard to the particular nation or community you live in. But it's not the most vulgar kind of nationalism or localism either, because the whole thing about sports is you look up and you see, wow, that player on that other team was really terrific too. And the Olympics in a way has the best of both worlds of that. A lot of, playing the USA, the national anthem, that's great. But then you look at someone else from another country performing terrifically and you think, well, that's really a fantastic story. The bicyclist who was getting her math degree, I think, and anyway, won this race that she wasn't supposed to win, or all these people like that. So the best things about sports everything gets ruined. I mean, this is is that JVL's? Trumpism corrupts everything.
Everything.
And so you can't enjoy sports, you can't root for your side, but also appreciate excellence from others anymore, because it's all dragged down by these extremely vulgar and unpleasant and really deplorable people.
Well, let me just read you one last tweet here from a writer named Kavitha Davidson, who I think writes for The Atlantic. Simone Biles won nationals with broken toes in both feet. Won a world championship with a kidney stone, and has carried the burden of being a face of sexual assault survivors as a national institution failed to support them. And half of y'all yelling about toughness cannot handle wearing a mask in Wegmans.
That's good. That's good.
I thought that put it in context. Okay, one last thing. There was a special election primary down in Texas in which the Trump-endorsed candidate was defeated. There are people cautioning against reading too much into this because the turnout was very low. But it does suggest that perhaps Trump's influence may have been somewhat overstated. I'm interested to get your take on that special election.
Yeah, I think that's right. It was LZ ran a better campaign. He's the one who defeated Susan Wright, the Trump-endorsed candidate, the widow of the former member of Congress. But it was a special election in which the two Republicans made the runoff. So I'm told, I was reading a little bit about it, and in touch with one person down there, some Democrats turned out a lot, just stayed home because there were two pretty conservative Trump acquiescent Republicans running, but one Trumpier than the other. But some Democrats turned out to vote for LZ just because he's less bad than Wright. And so ironically, the Democrats might have put LZ over, which is fine. It does mean that maybe among the Republican primary, Trump endorsement still remains very powerful, and so I wouldn't overinterpret it. I had a tiny bit part in this race, weirdly, because in 2018, LZ, he was a kind of impressive guy, a post 9/11 vet and so forth. He was was really kind of anti-Trump, closer to us. And so I sent him a modest check. And this became, in 2018, he lost that primary. So he became a member of the state legislature. And then in this race, this was used by the Club of Growth to attack Elsie as this, he received $250 from the most notorious anti-Trump hitman, William Kristol. And so I hope that they played that ad enough to get a few Democrats and a few independents and a few never Trump Republicans to say, well, I don't know if they're attacking Elsie for, having something in common with the never Trump people, maybe we'll go vote for Elsie. So I hope that ad backfired and maybe put Elsie over the top and made Trump's morning in Mar-a-Lago this morning kind of miserable. That would cheer me up.
Yeah, I just don't think he's having a great day today. I'm guessing that the mood is not, they don't have the white flag out over Mar-a-Lago. By the way, wouldn't that be perfect if they sort of had, flags over Mar-a-Lago? The mood today, orange would be he's really feeling good. Black, don't screw with him. Red, he's been watching too much Fox News, something like that. Bill Kristol, thanks so much for coming back on the podcast. Appreciate it very much as always.
Yeah, as always, Charlie, it was my pleasure.
And thank you for listening to today's Bulwark podcast. I'm Charlie Sykes. We will be back tomorrow, and we'll do this all over again.